Good evening. You're very welcome to this, the second of 7 webinars from myself and my colleagues here in Teagasc, Sligo, Leitrim, Donegal. My name is Cian Condon. I'm a dry stock advisor based in Manorhamilton, County Leitrim. And before we start this evening, we learned in recent days of the passing of Pat Gilooly. Pat was always a very strong IFA representative in County Leitrim, and he worked hard for the farmers in Leitrim and also for farmers all over the country. And on behalf of everyone here in Teagasc, we wish to send our deepest sympathies to his wife, Mary, his family, and a wide circle of friends. Our Yeshtay Goreba Hanum. Tonight, I'm joined by Shane Kilrane from the Mohill office and Paul Rigney from the Ballymote office, and they will be covering silage quality and animal rations again. So a very important and timely topic for all farmers. And similar to last week's webinar, both Shane and Paul will be presenting for about 15 minutes, plus some time for questions. Obviously, given the current situation with COVID, we're unable to hold our usual meetings, farm walks, seminars, and so on. But we hope these webinars will prove some useful, practical, and hopefully valuable information over the coming weeks. And on that basis, we're hoping to keep things fairly active and interactive. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat function where you can send your questions in right throughout this evening's session, and I will put them to our panel then once the presentations are finished. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague Shane Kilrane to share his screen, and we will begin.
Okay, thanks very much, Cian. Okay, so I'd just like to welcome you all this evening again. So this is the second of our series of webinars, and look, I'd like to continue on in kind of vein that Gary and Shane finished up on last week. They were talking about animal parasites and housing. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is silage quality. So, it's very timely. Most of the cattle are housed at this stage. It's been quite wet the last few weeks. So most, especially here in the northwest, a lot of cattle are housed, and silage quality, and Paul will be following up on rations, is very timely at the moment. Okay, so I suppose when we look at this, what affects our animals' performance, so whether we're sheep, dairy, and suckler, dry stock, over the next few months, we're housing now from the 1st of November, you could say. So in some cases, this could be for the next 6 months. What's going to affect that performance? So obviously things like lie-in space, I'll put on my pointer here. Lie-in space, feeding space, ventilation, water supply, parasite control, vaccination, what the lads covered last week. So I'm just going to focus on winter feed for this 15 minutes or so, and just have a few pointers on that. It's a very expensive time. Probably our winter costs make up about 75% of variable costs on dry stock farms. So it is a very expensive time. And, it's something that, if we can make savings over that period, it'll have a huge impact on profitability at the end of the day. See the red line coming there, I don't know where that has come from, but anyway. So look at whatever silage is in the yard at the moment, we can't really affect the quality of that. That's nearly past tense at this stage. So, if I want you maybe to think back over the last April, last May, last March, what you did that affected the silage quality in your yard, the stocks, whether it be in your pit or in your bales at the moment. So there's, just 4 key areas there. The yield. Okay, so there's lots of issues there. Did we put out enough fertilizer? Have we old traditional grasses? Have we, new ryegrasses? So there's, big differences there in yield. Cutting date. We can look at it. Some people like to hold out for a bit of bulk, but are they losing out in the long run on quality? So, there are some of the issues there. Digestibility. Okay, so how digestible the feed is. Okay, so that's going back to cutting date again, and level of fertilizer, and then the type of, whether it's old sward, new sward. So all them things come into play. Preservation, so very important. So we could have a perfect crop, but if we don't look after it properly, at the time of filling the silage pit or doing your baling, and get preservation right. And then finally, aerobic stability. So basically, we want anaerobic conditions straight away. So whether we're doing our pit silage or our bales, we want to get them wrapped as quickly as possible. We want to get the silage pit sealed up as quickly as possible, and get them bugs working, and get the silage, get it inside. Okay, so they're the sort of things just looking, some of you might have seen this graph before. Quite common. It's work that was done in Grange. So I'm just going to hide some of that. So we can look at, silage digestibility. Okay, so on the top here we have the different qualities. So 75, very good leafy silage, back down to quite poor silage at 60 DMD. So we can see the first thing here is intake. So intake goes up significantly at higher quality silage. So if you're up at 75 DMD, you can see your intake is 9 kilograms a day. Okay. As we work down to 70 DMD, you're at 8.3 intake, 7.6 at 65, and down as low as 7. Okay, when we're at 60 DMD. So it's important to note, a lot of the results we've been seeing the last number of years are in the region of between 65, 66, 67. And there's lots of farmers in all 3 counties making 75 plus DMD silage. But by and large, the average across the region would probably maybe 67, 68. So just bear that in mind. Obviously, live weight gain is what we're worried about because that's going to put money in our pockets. So at the start of the winter, it's obviously key that we want our animals to do a decent live weight gain over the winter. In this particular work that was done, these were beef cattle that were getting probably 5 kilos of concentrates, but you can see the live weight gain on the 75 DMD silage was 0.83. And then I just circled here, when we go down to a more average type silage, you can see how that went back to 0.49 kgs per day. Okay, so there's a huge variation. So I think that the key there is the higher the digestible silage, the higher the live weight gain, and obviously that will affect carcass gain down here and feed efficiency. When we talk about preservation, okay, so this is basically your taste and smell. Okay, so you all know what bad silage tastes like, and you all know what good silage tastes like, and you probably have neighbours come into the shed and say, pick it up and say, geez, that tastes, or that won't be tasting hopefully, but it smells good and it looks good. So you have a fair idea on the preservation, but poor preservation again will lead to poor intake, and as a result of that, you're going to have reduced live weight gain. So, on high or maybe wet silages, you'll see maybe high pH, and you might see that with some second cut silage where it hasn't preserved that well, or maybe leaf, second cut. There was good grass growth at this back end, and, a lot of paddocks and fields were taken out maybe for excess bales, and, it could be quite wet, so that there could be poor preservation if it's very leafy. You'll get that high ammonia taste, and it can lead to scouring, and you might even see cud balls in the morning after eating it. So, cattle just don't like it, so you're going to have reduced intake and use gain. Aerobic stability, what are we talking about here? So we're basically talking, you see the picture here of the bale with a lot of molds and heating on it. So look, they're around every farmyard, but we don't want them. It's leading to a serious loss of feed stuff, reduced intake, and molds are harmful both to animals, with pink eye, and they're harmful to humans as well. So the less of this, the better. And that comes back to probably the handling in that situation of the bale, how the bale was handled. Ideally we'd like to be wrapping bales near the sheds, near where they're going to be stacked. If you're driving 2 kilometers down the road, full tilt, and the bale is hopping on the back, you're going to be doing damage. There's going to be little holes there in the plastic, and, even stacking bales, little holes you don't see. But that's where you're heating and molding. The same with your pit. You want to reduce the level of damage. You want to inside quickly, get the cover on quickly, get it covered, get the anaerobic conditions in place. But when you're feeding out at silage, on a silage pit, you want to be feeding out as quick as possible. So if you open a bench, you don't want to be leaving it there just going once a week to it, because the quality of the silage will go down the longer the feed face is left open. So bringing it on, like why would we test our silage? Okay, so I don't know how many out there are testing silage. Quite low, maybe, increasing in the last few years, maybe through the use of discussion groups and that we've been pushing it. But you really, like anything else, you need to know the quality of what you're using. So it's like we go and get blood tests with the doctor or any other diagnosis, and we may change our habits because of that. So we need to know the quality. Okay. You have to bear in mind, silage is making up a huge amount of the feed over the winter. Okay, so we're great at talking about meals, and that's great meal, and this is great meal, and this crowd have a good meal, and that crowd have a good meal. But in reality, silage makes up the bulk of our winter feeding. So we need to put more an emphasis on what quality there that is. When we get our results, we can make better management decisions. Okay, and if we're making better management decisions, it'll help us reach our performance targets. Okay, so whatever our performance targets is, whether it's across any system, whether it's dairy and dry stock or sheep, we've all performance targets that we want to meet. So if we don't know the quality, we're not going to know the full story. I just have a note here using accredited lab. Okay, there's a number of them out there. Your silage test will cost about 30-35 euro. You're talking about a little bag like this and your label on it. And that goes off to an accredited lab. Why I say accredited lab, because they're used to, and they're using Irish conditions. There could be other labs using European sort of terminology and methods. So use an accredited Irish lab. So say it's about 30-35 euro. Some of the meal companies are probably doing it as well, free of charge. If you're a customer of them, that's probably one of the services, sort of an added perk, that they'll test it free of charge. So important to use an accredited lab. That's just an example of a silage sample report, the way it comes back. Look, it's not very legible there. I didn't intend it to be, but look, it'll give the key parameters there, such as dry matter, pH, ammonia levels, protein, energy, and DMD. So it comes back in that format, just something like a soil sample. And it gives you a comment, good, poor, satisfactory, and it kind of gives you a rating, and maybe what sort of supplementation with meal you might need based on your system. So that's what comes back to the farmer. And, I suppose one of the main things we're looking at on it is dry matter. And if you look at the little diagram here, what is dry matter? It's basically what's left after water is removed. Okay, so you can see the little diagram there at a 20% dry matter silage, 80% of it is water, and vice versa. If it's a 25% dry matter, 75% is water. Okay, so there's no energy. We don't need to measure water. We know what that accounts for. So we're only interested in the dry matter. High dry matter will give you higher energy for your animals, and ideally we'd like this above 25%. Okay, so look, that can range anything from very wet silage down to 17%, up to 30 plus is no problem. Just a word of note, maybe in silage pits, you don't really want it to go above 25 or 30%, just for feed out and that, so it's below 30% is adequate for silage pits. No problem with bales going higher than that. So I have an arrow up here, your dry matter, it'll have higher energy, and in turn that will stimulate higher intake in the animal. So the animal will actually eat more the higher the dry matter. Okay. You'll see yourselves, sometimes you have wet silage and you'll wonder, you'll go in the next day, so where did all them bales go? So the more water that's in it, obviously there's less dry matter, so the cattle will eat it a lot quicker because they need to be fed. They need to get their dry matter intake. Talking about digestibility, okay, so reasons why it can be below target. So we can have different causes of drops for DMD. So the first one I have up here is 1 week delay in harvesting. So look, ideally we'd like to be harvesting, by maybe the last week of May or as early as possible. So if we're talking about the last week of May, if you let that slip back into maybe the 10th of June, you might be losing 2 weeks there. So you could be looking at 2-3%, so maybe a loss of 6%. So every week in delay, we're talking about 3%. Old pasture, okay, so we're talking about, maybe pasture with little or no ryegrass in it. And, ryegrass, if your P's and K's and soil fertility isn't right, your ryegrass will die out anyway. So it might, go back to old pasture grasses. But the old pasture, you're looking at a reduction of 5% in DMD, and your silage, your ryegrass will respond better to chemical nitrogen, and also there's more sugar in your ryegrasses. There's about 50% more sugars, which is so important within silage. They'll react better. So you have 5% here. Not grazed out or dead butt there I have in brackets. Quite significant, 7%, and that could be significant this year. We've had a fairly wet back end, and a lot of cattle have been housed maybe earlier. There is grass supply out there, but just the current ground conditions aren't allowing it to be grazed. So there could be a lot of dead butt out there on your maybe silage field. So it's something to bear in mind. Okay, maybe not an issue on mixed farms for their sheep. Maybe they can get out, they're grazing it now maybe, or get out in spring and graze it, or in certain parts of the unit, where maybe weanlings could get out in early March or March time to graze that. But if that's left unchecked up to next May, it's still there on the ground. it's not going to be much better than straw. So you're looking at 7%. And then the last two here, bad preservation, so issues with maybe holes in the silage or high ammonia levels or whatever the case may be, 3%, and then heating that feed out of your pit. You're going to lose dry matter. The same with bales. Like if you try and fill a shed with a load of bales and think cows are going to eat it, they're going to leave stuff behind them. So they need fresh feed in front of them all the time, or it goes off. Quick word on protein, and Paul will be probably covering this, but we're just looking here at the proteins levels in animals' diets overall. So on a per kg of dry matter fed. So your weanlings in their overall diet, they need 13-14% protein. Finishing steers, heifers a bit less at 11 and 12%. Suckler cow, if she's pregnant, dry cow 10-11%. As she's calves, obviously her protein requirement will go up, so we're talking about 14%. And your dairy cow 15-17%. So protein is so important, especially in young animals. Like that's what gives them their frame, lets them grow. And if there's not sufficient protein in the diet, you're going to have stunting. And you often see them sort of cattle going through marts and that just look very small or stunted for their age. So it could be an issue over the winter where there hasn't been enough protein in the diet. Just to bring you bear in mind on that, when feeding rations, you have to say with your weanlings, we're saying 14% overall in the diet. If your silage, the range in your silages could be anything from 9% up to 15% up to 15+% in protein. So if your silage is a very low protein, would a 14% weaning ration be enough? No, you're definitely a minimum 16%. So you need to balance. Your silage is probably going to make up 2/3 of the dry matter intake. Your 2 kilos of meal maybe that you're giving your weanlings might not be sufficient to meet the protein requirements. So it's just something I want you to bear in mind. So with your results in place and by analysing them, and you can get your advisor, your consultant, or your meal rep to have a look at them. What sort of a supplementation are we talking about? So the first one up here I have is our suckler cow. Okay. So we're talking about the first one up here. I have a spring calver. I suppose it's important at the moment too, your housing cows is to kind of, sorry, I went too far ahead. You're going to try and group them together, whether it's based on calving date or what sort of condition they're in. So, you're probably maybe scanning the last month or so, you're going to put your February calving cows together, your March calving cows together, your January calving cows together. And the other thing you have to look at there is what sort of body condition they're in. So if they're in, one is less than the other, you'll try and group them animals together too based on condition scored. I suppose, to be honest, this year most cows are in good condition coming in. It's been quite a good grass year, so I don't think conditions is an issue. But when we're talking about our spring calving and silage quality, if we're looking here at our 72 DMD, if you're up at that 70 plus, 72, 75, you're probably looking at restricted intake of silage, maybe 80% of intake. And why do I say that? Okay, you don't want your cow getting too fat coming up to calving, because all the studies have shown as your body condition increases or as the animal cow gets fatter, it's going to lead to higher problems with calving. So we want our cows fit, but not over fat at calving. So we're talking about 80% of intake there. Okay. Your 65 DMD, your sort of average run of the mill, you're talking about fed tapetite. So there's no issue there. 65 DMD is fine for your spring calving cow. And then 60 DMD, so we're getting down to the lower qualities. We're talking about feeding this to appetite, but plus with 0.5 or to 1 kilo of meal extra. Important point to note there, just on the spring calver, if you are feeding 65 DMD, once she calves down, whether it be in January or February, and they're still going to be housed for a number of weeks, maybe 6-7 weeks, depending on what part of the country you're in. Essentially, this 65 DMD, your spring calver, turns into an autumn calver. She's going to need some supplementation. So when I say spring calver there, when she calves down in January, she will need some supplementation on this sort of silage. Looking back at maybe our autumn calvers, maybe what's calved down now in the last few weeks, what do they need? So we're talking, go back and talk about our 72 DMD silage. We're talking about ad lib silage plus 1.8 kilos of meal. Our 66, our moderate silage ad lib plus 2.5 kilo of meal. And then down at our lower value, 60 DMD, you're talking ad lib and 3 kilos of meal. Why is this important? with your autumn calvers, right? They're in sheds now, they're not out on grass, so their plane in nutrition is reduced, and you want them to get them back in calf. So you want to get them back in calf with, you know, maybe 50, 60 days from now. Keep your 365 interval going. So if they don't get that plane in nutrition, you know, you're going to run into issues getting cows back cycling and getting them back in calf. The other thing there, as I said, consider your cow condition, group them together that way, and don't forget your mineral supplementation. Okay, so is your minerals going to be in the meal? You know, could we be always recommending give your pre-calvers 6 weeks before, but then obviously whether after calving, whether you give boluses or what sort of mineral supplementation to your cows. Just looking at dairy cows, I just grabbed this from one of my dairy advisors, and I'll not dwell, but it's the same message. The higher the silage quality, the less meal it has to be fed. So I'm just looking at, I'll go straight here at the bottom at maybe plus 30 litres, 32 litres here. On 65 DMD silage, what do we need to be feeding? So we're talking about 10.5 kilos. You compare that to your 75 DMD silage, it's 85 kilos, okay? So you take 100 cow herd, that's 2 kilos a day. On 100 cows is 200 kilos a day. So over a week, you're hitting nearly 1.5 tons alone in that sort of scenario. So the savings are huge. So you can multiply that out by a month, 2 months, whatever way you want, but it gets bigger every time. So there's huge variation. So there's a saving there, and that's on 65 versus 75 of 2 kilos. So that's going to be huge on the bottom line. Okay, it's no different. I think the key message is the higher the quality of the silage, the less meal that's needed. Looking at our weanlings, so conscious we're in quite a dry stock area, our weanlings and stores. So just looking at here, we have our different quality silage here, and then we have our average daily gain. So on 75 DMD, we're talking they should be doing 0.5 a kilo plus on silage alone. When this drops down to 70, it comes down to 0.3 of a kilo. When we go down to 65, your moderate silage, 0.2. And then when we get down to 60 DMD, weight loss. I was talking to one of our nutritionists yesterday, and I says, what about a figure for 60 DMD? He says, Shane, just type in weight loss. So I'm not even going to put a figure there. So on that low quality silage, basically what we're saying is you'll be putting your weanlings in, and they'll probably come out the other end next winter lighter than they went in. Okay, I just have a footnote here again of 0.2 kilos a day will stunt animals, and we've seen all them sort of animals around. You know, if you go to marts or that, you'll see animals very small for age, and just, you know, and they're just not desirable in this day and age because it takes so long to get them finished. You know, they're so far lagging behind. Over the winter, I suppose, on these sort of weanlings or stores, we'd, you know, ideally we want to be getting 0.6 of a kilo average daily gain. Okay, so that's our key performance that we want to get to at a minimum. So what sort of levels are we talking about? So on the 75 DMD, we're talking about half a kilo. Okay, and I talked to the nutritionist on this, and he was saying, you know, I was saying maybe in some cases that 75 plus silage, they won't need any meals, would they? He says, you know, maybe not, but he says no harm to put in a kilo there for the first few months, and then, you know, by weighing and by checking their performance, you know, maybe in January, February, you can reduce the meal altogether. So, you know, he was thinking just as make sure that there's enough protein in the diet, so there'll be some little level of supplementation. At 70 DMD, to get this 0.6 kilo, we're talking about 1.5 kilos concentrate. At the 65 DMD, that's going up to 2.25, and then at the very low 60 DMD, we're talking probably 3 kilos. So you can see the huge variation as we move down there. Okay, so this next slide is practically the same. I've just added in a few euro signs to that because at the end of the day, it's euros that we're worried about and trying to cut our costs and boost our profits. So it's the exact same slide here, the 75 DMD at half a kilo. I'm basing this on concentrate, weanling concentrate at 280 a ton over 150 days. So a 5-month winter in some cases. You know, some animals could be in 6 months. So at that half a kilo, it's working out at 21 euro an animal. So I'm just being modest here on 20 weanlings, average run of the mill for, you know, the area we're in. That's going to cost you, okay, 420 euro at 280 a ton. Go down to your 70 DMD, it's 12.60 when we feed 1.5 kilos, so it's €63 an animal. By year 20, it's coming up at 12.60. At 95 or at the 65 DMD, it works out at €95 per animal and going up to 1900. And at the 60 DMD, you can see it's really skyrocketing now. You're up at 2,500, €126 per animal at 2,500. So even between the 70 DMD and the 65 DMD, you're talking nearly, in the guts of €700 just extra to get that 0.6 of a daily gain over the 150 days. Okay, so I'm conscious of time. So just in conclusion, I think please get your silage tested. There's a lot of cases you can get it done for free. The winter time is the most expensive time on our farms and across all systems. So on foot of that, choose a suitable supplement. So, it depends, if you're feeding suckler cows, if you're feeding weanlings, if you're feeding finishing animals, it's all going to be a different type of concentrate. So you're going to base that on your silage results, feed accordingly. And finally, what can you improve, or what can we improve in farmers for 2021? I spoke at the start about yields and preservation. What can you do? Are you putting out enough fertilizer? Are you wilting grass? Is your sward too old? All those things. Are we leaving cutting dates too late? So there's loads of things to think about. We could run this next February, March again, and just purely on getting ready for silage 2021. So they're the sort of issues there. So I think that's it, Cian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shane. That's great. As I mentioned at the start, we're going to be taking questions. I'm conscious of time, so we're going to move on to Paul there in a minute. So Shane, if you want to stop sharing your screen, and we'll get Paul to share his screen now for the second one. But don't forget about the chat function there at the bottom of your screen. So if anyone has any questions, be sure to send them in the chat function, and we will do our best to have them all answered by the time we wrap things up there before 9 o'clock. Okay, Paul, whenever you're ready, if you want to share your screen and maybe put on your video, you can shut down yours, Shane, and I'll do mine too.
Can you see that, Cian?
Yeah, thanks. Perfect, Paul.
Okay. Thanks, Cian. Thanks, Shane. My name is Paul Rigney, and I'm a dry stock advisor based in the Ballymote office. I'm kind of kicking off where Shane finished off there and dealing with winter feeding and specifically on rations. So I suppose traditionally we use rations to bridge the quality gap, the difference between silage quality and what we needed to finish our animals or attain a particular level of productivity. In more recent years, for various reasons, mainly intensification and probably elements of changes in weather patterns and fodder crises, we've unfortunately had to supplement the quantity gap on a more regular basis. So my talk is going to deal with the different types of feeds, the different ingredients we're looking at when we look at a compound feed. We're going to deal with energy feeds, protein feeds, digestible fibres feeds, other ingredients. Probably the most important part of the presentation will deal with actually reading the label to see what the components or the main components are in the feed that we're paying for. Then we'll look at the requirements for your stock as an individual, no more than ourselves as human beings. Our livestock are all different. We have different requirements for them. We have different aspirations for them. And the last two sections there then will deal with the management of feeding, which obviously is extremely important. And we'll overlap a little bit with what Shane went through. And then I suppose given the current format of this webinar, I don't know if a take-home message is the right way of describing it, but we'll have some sort of message at the end anyway. So our energy feeds. Our energy feeds are our most important nutrient. They're needed primarily for maintenance and productivity. All feeds are measured relative to barley, and without complicating things, we have a UFL and a UFV. The UFL is what most of us would be dealing with for lactating animals and younger stock. And then the UFV deals with people that are finishing animals solely. So the UFL, as I said, it relates solely to barley, and we're comparing it to 1 kilogram of barley. So we can see from this slide here that the four most important energy feeds are barley, wheat, oats, and maize in this country. So obviously the UFL of barley is 1 because it's equivalent to itself. It has a crude protein of 10%. Wheat, very similar to barley, UFL of 1, and again a crude protein of 10%. Oats are 90% of the energy rating of barley, and again a crude protein of 10%. And maize is 5% above barley and wheat with a crude protein of 8.5%. We'll see how important these figures are when we analyse a few labels later on and make comparisons. So our energy feeds, generally for beef cattle rations, we want UFL or UFV of anywhere around 0.93 or 0.94 as fed. Recent studies over the last, indeed ongoing studies over the last few years in Moore Park, they show at moderate levels of concentrates, no particular energy source favoured milk production or composition. However, all energy sources increase dry matter intake, milk production, and milk protein concentration. So what that's really saying is at relatively low levels of concentrates, the individual energy ingredients don't matter as long as the overall energy requirement is met. Our protein feeds then, protein are very important for our younger stock. They're needed for growth at specifically though, and importantly at underfeed protein, obviously we are going to stunt growth. If we overfeed protein, there's 3 downsides to that. The first one is that we're paying for protein, which in general is one of the more expensive elements of the feed. Secondly, if we're incorporating protein above the requirements in the feed, it's probably to the detriment or to the lack of the energy feeds which we need. And thirdly, in order to break down the protein into amino acids, the ruminant is using a lot of the energy to actually make that breakdown, which obviously is energy that that ruminant cannot use for productivity or maintenance. So we're probably all an awful lot more familiar with the term crude protein percentage when we go in to buy a ration or compare a ration than we are with the UFL or the UFV figures. But I would hope that if you get nothing else out of this presentation, that you'd be familiar with the concept of UFL and at the very least be able to ask your merchant or your sales rep about it. So our common protein feeds, the most common one I suppose is soya with a UFL of just over 1 and an extremely high protein source at 48%. Distillers is down at 25%, and then peas and beans 20 and 25, corn gluten 20%, and rapeseed meal 34%. I suppose when we're talking about protein for derogation farmers, it's important that you're aware of all the changes that are coming in the next 2 years. Most of you will be doing courses next year, if you haven't done it already this year, on as a requirement for being a derogation farmer. So dairy cows at grass, the maximum for 2020 crude protein ration can be 16%, and that's been reduced to 15% in 2021. So it's just something to be aware of. Don't get caught at the last minute. Start budgeting for that now and planning for that now. Research studies, I think so far we've concentrated a little bit too much on bovines, so we'll give the sheep side of the house a bit of time here. Dr. Tim Keedy, he's a researcher in the Teagasc in Athenry, and he did a study recently on the concentrates for ewes, specifically focusing on ingredient composition. He was using soybean meal inclusion, and he found it to be more effective than actually increasing overall feed by 75%. So at an extra cost of 32 cents per ewe to include this soybean meal in the ration, but it increased for a ewe-bearing twins, it increased the weights of the lambs weighing by 1.8 kilos. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that 1.8 kilos, we'll say by the time you get to the factory and kill out, is at least a kilo. So we're talking in current prices somewhere well over €5 per ewe for putting the soybean meal into the ration. So it's very important that we include that. So basically, his main research question was: is it important to focus on the ingredient composition, or do we just go on the overall crude protein and energy components of the concentrate? And obviously, with that figure coming out of it, he concluded that the focus on ingredient composition is vital when we're purchasing concentrates, which, as I said, we will do in a few minutes. Digestible fibres, then, probably not as much said about digestible fibres. They're needed to keep the rumen functioning well. The more common ones, again, in Ireland are citrus pulp, soya hulls, beet pulp, and palm kernel expeller. They have UFLs ranging from anywhere from 0.85 to 1, and crude protein is fairly big variation from pulp at 6% up to palm kernel expeller at 14%. Usually for beef, we are looking for kind of anywhere around the 8 to 9% digestible fibre percentage in our concentrate. Other ingredients, and I suppose these are the ones that come with a health hazard on them. We have wheat feed, or pollard as it's known as. It has a UFL at 0.75, so it's basically 3/4 of the feed of barley. It has a crude protein at 16%. Marginally.
Do they stay here or do what?
Just.
Barley.
Oh, that's on your page, is it?
Yeah, you don't have to be in that for them to like end.
Molasses
Or
then
not connection.
in here. Most merchants or producers obviously include molasses as a binding agent. However, its UFL is at about 0.78 and crude protein at 4.5. But when we look at the ingredients, obviously when we're looking at a ration, all the ingredients are given in descending order. So molasses is quite useful from the point of view that it's put in at between 2 and 5%. So we know the ingredients above it are above that level, and the ingredients below it are at an extra level below that. Then we have minerals and vitamins at anywhere around 2.5%.
I can't even see that there.
You can see it there. You can see if someone's typing.
Sorry, I think I was muted
Yeah,
there.
sorry, Paul. There's a lot of noise coming in, and I just had to mute her for 1 second.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
no problem, Keane. Right, so if we look at ration 1, then I'm not going to go into it in huge detail. Basically, if we look at the composition there in descending weight order, what I would be inclined to look at are 2 things. Look at the first 4 ingredients. Will give us a fair idea if we compare it to the ones that I've gone through earlier as to the quality of the ration, and also look at where molasses comes in. So if we look at ration 1, we have maize and we have wheat, maize gluten, and soya hulls. So they're the first 4 ingredients. We'll analyze them a little bit more on the next section. And molasses comes in here at this stage. So while we don't get a percentage, because there will be variability from one batch to the next batch of meal, and that's why we're not getting percentages, but we do know that anything below molasses is at a very insignificant level. So ration 2 is a little bit harder to see there. I think the label was in my back pocket for a little bit longer than it should have been, or it could have gone through the washing machine. But I'll summarize it on the next slide anyway, and it'll become more apparent. The main composition, or what we're looking at, is barley, sunflower seed, distiller's grain, and palm kernel. So if we make a comparison between these 2 rations, so our first ration, as I said, first 4 components were maize, soybean meal, wheat, and maize gluten. The second ration, we had barley, sunflower seed, distillers, palm kernel. Obviously, if we were face to face or in a meeting, I'd be getting a show of hands as to who thought which ration was the better ration. And both rations have 18% crude protein. So if we went into the merchant and based our purchase solely on crude protein, we could pick up ration 1 or ration 2 at the flip of a coin. There was very little price difference between the two rations. So again, it would be 50-50 as to which one we pick up if we didn't look at the ingredients. However, ration 1 has 16% more energy than ration 2. So if we went for ration 2 at roughly the same price, it would have cost us in the long run. So the requirements for your stock. Shane went through it in detail there earlier, the silage quality. A lot of what we spoke about so far has referred to crude protein, and while we have overall crude protein figures for diets depending on the stock, we also have crude proteins in our concentrates. So in order to determine what crude protein we need in our concentrate, we need to know the crude protein of the silage quality, or we're not going to be able to gauge it accurately. So as Shane hammered home to you all, the most important thing out of even these two presentations is get your silage analysed. And at least you have a starting point. You can decide to ignore it if you want, but at least you have the information and you can run with it or not. Secondly, it's very important, regardless of what enterprise you're in, to obviously body condition score your livestock. Do that in a timely manner. Don't leave it, as a lot of us may do, until they're a month in the shed. Do it beforehand when they're in the yard. If the size of your enterprise and your facilities lend itself, split them up into different pens based on their BCS, and obviously feed then dependent on the body condition score. Genomics then, it's very easy. Well, going back in the days pre this pandemic, when we met in the pub on a Saturday night and we were chatting about, Shane alluded to it earlier there, the neighbour thinking he found the best meal and that it was put in great condition on his cattle or sheep or whatever. Just because that meal suits the neighbour doesn't necessarily mean it'll suit us. All of our livestock are different. As I said, we have body condition score, we have different silage quality. Even genomics, which is an increasing thing, well, especially on the beef side of things, that we're becoming aware of over the last 6 years with the BDGP or Beef Data and Genomics program. There's an element for feed intake in your Eurostar rating of all of our animals. 15% of it, of feed intake, relates to the terminal side, with 4% relating to the replacement side. So if you have predominantly 4 or 5 star animals and your neighbour is talking about feeding 1, 2 star animals or vice versa, not necessarily the same feed won't give you the same results. Obviously, we also have different expectations. Perhaps we're happy with the 0.3 kilos per day live weight gain on our weanlings, or we want to push them to 0.6, 0.7. We've experienced compensatory growth at the traditional 0.3 once they go out onto the fields, and we're happy enough with that it compensates for the lesser level of meal. And then obviously finances come into it. Can we afford to pump this meal into the animals? Are we in an enterprise that has a negligible profit margin? And where can we make these savings, and is meal going to be one of them? I suppose to answer that question, if you go back to the slide that Shane put up there earlier, with the silage down at 60 to 65 DMD, I would suggest that we cannot afford not to feed those animals with concentrates, or we're as well off probably sell them in the back end of the year and not put them into the shed at all. Finances, where can we make our savings then? Regardless of whether we have a half a dozen cows or 600 cows, there's economy of scale to be gained there at all stages. Whether it's to change from going into town every 3 or 4 days and picking up 3 or 4 bags of meal and putting them in the back of the boot, or maybe getting a half ton or 3/4 ton meal bin, putting it on the trailer and going in once every 5 or 6 weeks. Are there adequate savings to be made there? At the higher scale then, where we have the meal bin, is it worth maybe getting the second meal bin or bigger meal bins at a huge scale? Can we get to the stage where we can get a lorry to reverse in and dump its whole load in our yard? And have we savings to be made there? Obviously, credit terms, that needs to be negotiated beforehand and can be used as a bargaining tool if we can pay cash on delivery versus pushing it down the road a bit. And then regardless of your scale, the concept of getting involved with like-minded farmers who have similar stock, maybe similar needs when it comes to rations, and maybe setting up a purchasing group. So that's something that we could be looking into. So management at feeding. So I suppose our housing, the most important 2 elements of this is that we have adequate lying space for the livestock and that we have sufficient room at the barrier, that they're not going to be at risk of injury when we're coming with meal. Ventilation, we want to benefit from the stack effect here. So we want adequate inflow and outflow, that when the air is coming in, it's pushing the hotter air up, and with that it's bringing any microbes or bugs with it and decreasing the chances of passing on airborne diseases. Dosing and parasites, to have a proper management system or regime in place there. I'm not going to go into that because for those of you that were on last week in rather big numbers, that was gone through by Gary and Shane. Obviously, we want adequate supply of water and good quality clean water. And as man says, if you wouldn't drink it yourself, don't expect the animal to drink it. Our feeding regime then is probably the most important thing here. Animals, no more than ourselves, they don't like change. They want to be fed at the same time every morning, or if we're feeding more than 5 kilos a meal per day, split feeding. But insofar as possible, have at the same time morning, same time evening. Again, insofar as possible, and if your personal circumstances allow it or work allows it, have as close to 12 hours between 2 feedings as possible. When you are getting them into the meal or getting them used to meal, obviously increase it in small increments so their stomach can get used to the change in diet. And again, insofar as possible, don't change diet midstream. If you are reasonably happy with the ration that you're using, stick with it, because there will be a term of change when you change the ration type, and it could lead to loss of weight over that period. Again, monitor animal performance regularly. You body condition score them before they went in. Good management practice would dictate that you do that on a semi-regular basis, and even if that involved moving animals from one pen to another to increase or decrease the level of meal that they were being fed. So again, I have in quotation marks here take-home messages. Make sure you buy all your meal or concentrates from a DAFM approved supplier. There's a list of those on the Department of Agriculture Food and Marine website. They are monitored, their produce are sampled to make sure that, as the man says, it does exactly as it says on the tin. I suppose most importantly, and maybe it's something new for some of us to get our heads around, deal with energy first and then protein. So protein is very easy to look at. It's a 16% ration, it's 14%, it's 12%. Is 14% better than 12%? We can make a very easy comparison there in percentages. However, energy isn't that simple when we're looking at UFL, which most of us will be looking at. But it's something that we do need to increasingly get our heads around. And any person that's come and selling their produce to you in the yard will understand the concept, and you ask them about it. You ask them what is the UFL of that feed. Ignore the name and look at the label. A high protein feed, what does that mean? High protein relative to what? High energy feed or high gain feed, again, what does it mean? Look at the label, read the first 4 ingredients. They will give you a fair idea of what's actually in the meal. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There's plenty of people around, more than willing and able, even with current restrictions of COVID and everything. Technology has made us all more accessible, and we are there to answer any questions. So get in contact with your Teagasc advisor or private consultant, get in contact with your merchant, your sales rep, or if you think you have fertility issues or calf bed retention or anything, placenta retention or anything like that, that may be linked to a mineral or vitamin deficiency, get in contact with your vet. Finally, just a plug for a calculator on the Teagasc website. It's on the public website, but it's very interesting. It's if you go into the beef section there, it's on nutrition. It shows the relative values of feeds. So if you can get the value of, or what you can get barley at, and what you can get soya at, and put the 2 figures there into that system, it will it'll allow you then to make comparisons on any other feed as to whether they're good value or bad value. Now, that is me done. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll hand you back to Cian.
Thanks very much, Paul. You can leave that on the screen for the moment, just with the link on it there. I think it'd be handy. Shane is there as well. We might get Shane to put his camera on as well.
Yeah, should be.
Yeah. So just one of the very first questions in there is about trying to decide or trying to estimate what should be the protein level that's being fed to high yielding cows. Can you just give us a comment on that, please?
Yeah, so look at high yielding cows. I had a slide up there, so with the different animal class. So you're talking probably 17% in the overall diet, okay, per dry matter fed. So if your silage maybe is at 16% protein, then probably an 18% ration protein would be adequate. On the other hand, if your silage down low at maybe 12% protein, you could be looking at high as 20% protein supplementation needed. So that'd be to balance the diet at that 16%. So look, someone like that might need to look at feeding maybe soya full, or some other type of ration, just to bring up the product. But look, it highlights the importance of silage testing. So like, you're in the dark if you don't really know whether you're at 10% protein, 12% protein, 16% protein. So it's all relevant.
Yeah, and just while we're on about that side of things, and I'm sure it's much the same. There was another question come in about how much silage and meal, how much of each should be fed to maiden heifers, let's say approaching bulling time, and it just
Right.
Can you give a comment on that as well, just while you're
Right.
discussing
My
that?
dairy head on here. Okay, so right, I suppose these heifers, if they're coming near ready for they should be, I'd say, near bulling or near calving. Sorry.
Just coming into bulling, I think is what the question was.
So there should be 60% of their body weight, probably for bulling. So the protein requirement there is probably something similar, 15%. What sort of supplementation? Again, it's gone back to what's in the silage. But if it's if the silage is up at 15%, probably very little supplementation needed there at all. Especially as that animal grows higher, closer to target weights. So again, it's back to silage. You're talking probably about maybe 10 kilos of dry matter in the overall, for our overall requirement would be in silage.
Okay, that's spot on. Was there anything else there? And there? Oh yeah, just another one just for you there that came in, Shane. Just you might just want to comment on this. Is the difference between chopping silage and unchopping, the take on intakes based on chopped or unchopped?
Okay, well, I suppose look at Yeah, no, just on the chop length, I suppose there was work done by Pádraig O'Reilly there in Teagasc, and what he would have found was the shorter chop length was more suitable to sheep, indeed, but you'd have better intake from the sheep side. On the cattle side, maybe less intake with the longer chop, and just on maybe wet silage or second cut, maybe you want to be careful about chopping because it can just run through the animal that bit quicker. Low fiber content, so it could lead to scouring or that. But, depending, yeah, short chop for sheep, better intake, and the opposite maybe on the cattle side.
Okay, so look, we're coming up towards 9 o'clock. I can see a couple of questions there, and I know some of my colleagues have actually answered some of these on the chat. If you've been looking at this, I can see James Keane and Gary Fisher have been active there. And one of the questions I'll just go through, just in case people haven't seen it. For finishing cattle, what requirement is there for protein in the ration? Can you get away with high energy feed balanced with straw, digestible fibre, and good quality silage? And James Keane has come in there. Say yes, 11% protein in the finishing ration would be fine. Finishing animals need high energy to put on flesh, and protein is more for the growing stock, yearlings, weanlings, and so on. Make sure the fibre in the overall diet is in balance in case the rumen or stomach upsets, and if ad lib, then build up over 3 weeks. Another question there on the highest level of protein you can in soil safely without a problem. And just Gary has commented there again that where you have high red clover content, that you can have protein levels of 18 to 20%, and once it's treated in the right manner, that there's no insolubility problems with that. Let me see now, and just Veronica Ryan there is commented just back to the high yielding cow, is that the range was 20 to 35 litres, and that's quite it's quite a big range. It's kind of about whatever to 60 or 70% of a difference between one and the other, and that the energy requirements will be quite different, and maybe they should be split and addressed correctly then in order to make sure that they're fed entirely correctly. So I think we are bang on 9 o'clock, which we are. That's basically it for this evening. We hope you found the presentations useful, hopefully for your farm. And the intention is to have both this and last week's seminar up on our YouTube channel, hopefully on our Teagasc webpage as well, but on the our own YouTube channel by Friday this week. And we will be circulating it both in WhatsApp, Puka, and on social media when they are available there. The series is continuing for another 5 Tuesdays, and you'll find full details of that by following Teagasc SLD, Sligo Leitrim Donegal, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. Next week's webinar is on sheep parasites and their treatment. So again, another very important, a very topical issue, and we'd love if you could join us again. And remember, despite the current restrictions, you can always contact your Teagasc advisor by phone, text, and email. Thanks for joining us this evening. Stay safe and good night.